Okay, here we go. I'm going to start this morning with a change. I'm going to do a prayer that I found on Facebook, which is the senility prayer. Some of you may have heard it. Grant me the senility to forget the people I never liked anyway, the good fortune to run into the ones I do, and the eyesight to tell the difference. So I grew up as a kind of a wild country kid in Catskill Mountains. We had 6 houses in a complex provided by my dad's employer. He was chief chemist in New York City Water Supply System, and we were stationed upstate in Ashoka, in New York. You know, it was like 1.5 miles to the next house after that, which was actually my piano teacher. So I was adopted at an early age from Staten Island, 6 months, I think. And I started out in one-room country school. Later, I got bused daily to Kingston, New York, which was 16 miles away, to go to a more organized school. And then our central school district consolidated, and I went from junior high through graduation into a central school system. I graduated in 1959, and interestingly, I won the American Legion award, got a little $100 for, despite my opinion of them, I still managed to do it, an essay that they liked. Tried to get into Oberlin College, Amherst, that didn't work, but I did get into Lehigh and Lafayette and Wesleyan and Union, and I chose Union College in Schenectady. I was a better student in college, quite a bit better than in high school. I was Dean's List for 16 quarters, which enabled me to take an extra course without paying the tuition. So I was for a while a dual physics and history major. I chose physics as apt to provide a better livelihood, and I've always wondered what would happen had I gone the other path. But I liked that combination because, you know, I had the technical homework, but then when I was tired of doing that, I could read stuff for the history classes, and that kind of gave me a nice mix, which I lost when I went to graduate school. Again, I applied to a number of schools. You know, I tried to get into Yale, and and that didn't work. I ended up at the University of Rochester as a physics major, which lasted a bit, but I had problems with that idea of always doing the same kind of homework, hours and hours of quantum mechanics or stuff like that. And I eventually decided to drop and switch to applied math master's program in the evening, and I had applied to both Corning and U of R. Corning had a slightly better offer for employment, but Linda at that point gotten into the grad school at the university here, so I chose to come here. I'd met Linda at a Midnight Pete Seeger concert in Woodstock, New York. Actually, I had known her because of a combined dating that a group of friends did. But this Pete Seeger concert, I remember that well because we got home, we got into a discussion on religion, which lasted till 4 in the morning. So your dad wouldn't talk to me for a year because he didn't believe that we were just discussing religion out in the car at that hour. But remember that was actually the truth. So I was at Union 1959 to 63. I used to hitchhike on weekends, either back down to my folks' place, because Linda's parents had a summer place in Bearsville, which was 1 mile outside of Woodstock, New York, or I would hitchhike into New York City. In those days, that seemed a little safer. And we spent a weekend there, hitchhike back. In fact, I hitchhiked so much on the thruway that there was a guy that developed a whole bunch of people who knew who I was, regular commuters. So I frequently got rides from the same people, and so often got dropped off door to door. So it was a pretty nice arrangement. We got married in 1963 after Linda finished the semester early. Got married after I graduated, also the sort of a requirement of both sets of parents that we have the degrees first. And I mentioned that I got into Rochester. My employment at Kodak began. I did a lot of stuff, particularly in military intelligence work, which is an odd situation relative to my viewpoint. I did that work until I got tired, and I was the first Kodak employee to voluntarily turn in my top secret security clearance. I just didn't want it anymore. I lasted at Kodak for 33 years. Kodak was quite a respectable employer in that period. You know, we had medical stuff, we had our x-rays done, you know, and there was, you know, they paid for all of my master's degree and all that stuff. It was a different company than it later became. I got involved in every activity. At that time, I was in the bicycle club, Rochester Bicycle Club, as an officer of that, a Genesee Valley chapter of the Adirondack Mountain Club. I was in the Greece Democratic Party, which I led for 8 years back in the 60s, the late 60s, I think. Well, we had kids, Lisa, who's now a UU minister in Minnesota, and Tanya, now a graphics designer out in Seattle, Chateau St. Michel Wine Estates. We did a lot of things, kids, and Lisa and I did a lot of political stuff in the church. I remember I particularly remember some of them, like the nuclear disarmament task force and some stuff that Dick Fitz got us involved in. You know, that was a good period. Lisa went off to Oberlin. Actually, she was a triple major, believe it or not. Tanya went to the University of Michigan for a bit, and then transferred to RIT because she liked their graphics design program, and she did a bachelor's in graphics design and a master's in electronic publishing, which turned out to be a very good combination. I developed an early interest in music. You know, a kid, I tried to play clarinet and piano. Clarinet became a problem when I had to do, see the orthodontist and do braces, and that didn't work as well. And the piano, I sort of lost interest in the practicing, which was an issue. I remember being a devilish kind of kid, so I would eat the chives that I found out in the yard before I had the piano lesson, so that the teacher would kick me out earlier. But that didn't go anywhere. My sister, of course, we had a really good piano. My sister ended up being a piano performance major out of the Oberlin Conservatory. So we always had a one size under the concert grand in the home. And we listened to a lot of music, and we put a big antenna up on the roof so we could pull. We were just on the fringe. We were upstate in the Ashokan area, is about 120 miles maybe as a crow flies out of New York City. So with an antenna on the roof, we could pull the 2 classical music stations out of New York City. WQXR, which was a New York Times station, and WNYC. And I'd listen to that. And that was one of the problems later when some of the famous pop music, I didn't really learn till later in life when my kids started listening to it. I was always along here. As a kid, I didn't listen to anything other than classical music. So, you know, that was interesting. As I say, my sister was at Oberlin. She overlapped Dave Zinman. So it was interesting. I got out to Oberlin a number of times. And then, of course, later when Lisa was out there, was out to Oberlin again quite quite a bit. Just a very wonderful involved. My sister was also in ballet, interested in ballet. I was not, though I did go down a few times when the family went down to New York City for ballet performances. But I was always a critical listener. My sister had what they call absolute pitch, which meant she could walk up to a piano and tune it. I had what was called perfect relative pitch, which meant if you tuned the first note for me with a tuning fork, I could tune the rest of the piano to that note. But I had to get the first note set for me. Now, I don't know what that means, other than maybe it's something to do with the fact that I'm fairly critical in my listening to music, particularly vocal music, because I follow the sounds pretty carefully. So anyway, we got kids, of course, at some point where, we were up in Mother of Sorrows, which is one of the more conservative Catholic parishes, walking distance of the house, which meant most of the kids in the neighborhood were going there. So the kids were coming home with all kinds of stuff they were hearing, and we decided maybe we should do something about it. So we decided we had to check into some religious options. Linda checked most of the temples. Of course, they didn't want to talk to her if I wasn't there, because and we found a lot of discussion about dropping kids off for programs as parents didn't attend, and that didn't have a lot of appeal. But I worked for a couple of UUs at Kodak. Early on, I had worked for Roger Coakley. I didn't know he was a church involvement at that point. I learned that later. But I worked with Don Fader in optics, and Don invited us on a ski trip, and I had been doing a little bit of skiing, and we went off to Stowe, Vermont, and the Gilberts were on that trip and with the boys, and we got to talk to Dick, and then this sounded pretty interesting, so we decided to check out the church. This would be 1974, 1975, I don't remember. We joined, I think, in 75. I think it was the same day Vicki and Dick Schwartz joined, actually, if I remember right. That worked out pretty interesting. I always told Dick that I had, the skiing got me in the going downhill business, and once I was going downhill, I figured I could join the church. We were pretty happy with that. Everybody attended. At that time, they had the family service between the other services, and we would stay around for most of the morning. And we just found it a very rewarding experience. Meanwhile, of course, I had, 30 plus years of no religious involvement. I just could not, did some temple attending as an attempt to thing as a young person, and there was just, I didn't feel that, I felt that the religion was too much interested in Israel and Zionism, which, I support Israel's right to exist, but, I didn't want to go hearing all these stories every time that were aimed then at support of what my dad had taught me. My dad had taught me to drop a level plumb line, and I was not finding that in how Palestinians and others were being treated, and I didn't want to really hear that in religious services. I just decided, and my dad was, since it was a 16-mile drive to take me to anything class or anything related to our pre-bar mitzvah, my dad kind of laid down the rule that if I was interested in doing this and interested in learning a bit of the language and interested in learning what stuff meant, he was willing to do this drive. But if I was just going to go there and learn to make sounds by rote not knowing what I'm talking about, and just to get through a ceremony, he didn't think that was worth either of our time. And I ended up having to agree with that. As to the church history, many of you probably know that. I probably won't dwell as much on it. I did spend half of my adult life in church finance in one capacity or another, and people probably know about my bylaws work with Ann and Barb, a number of other things, Gilbert Spirit Fund, which I was inspired to start by my daughter Lisa, who sent me this aggressive message one time. Hey, Dad, Dick's retiring. You're not just going to let him have a little party and call it that, right? You're going to do something about more significant, right, Dad? So I got thinking about that, and I got a little team. I'm trying to remember. I think Glenn was on it, maybe Steve Brown, Dick Schwartz, I know, was involved, and we planned out. We thought maybe we could raise $75,000. And actually, in 6 weeks, I think we raised $155,000. What I had not figured out, I think part of what drove that, besides a couple of very generous people in the elder women population, the older widows, was that for a number of people who had kind of dropped back from the church because their kids were no longer in RE, they were off to college and this and that, and they got into the Sunday Times and whatnot, that this provided an opportunity for them to part feeling that they honored Dick and that they had done something significant. So there were a whole chunk of, $5,000 and kinds of contributions, and so that was a successful thing. And we had the wisdom, and maybe this was even Dick Schwartz's idea, that we only be involved in the fundraising. We have no involvement whatsoever in the gifting. That be turned over, the board could figure out how to do that, and none of us would really be into that, and we would just raise the money and drop out of sight, which I think is what actually happened. Now, there was some discussion, maybe Glenn went into the organ transplant. I remember that well, because that was the night of Linda's car accident where the drunk driver hit her. And it was also when I first, apparently, I had this problem with, it's 1981, I had this problem with, apparently I had a large abscess in my liver, which I ruptured through the diaphragm when I was up on the ladder working on some organ pipes. I remember that moment pretty well because I almost came down off the ladder. But anyway, I ended up having Dick had called, and we had obviously depart and head over to Rochester. It was Park Ridge at first, and then transferred to Rochester General, where they had more capability for this kind of thing. And then I remember, then I ended up, swinging by my docs because I couldn't get rid of this pain, and I was almost 26 pounds in 4 days, and swung by my doc and didn't get home for 16 days. I ended up in strong for what they figured out the surgery they needed to perform. And that I remember pretty well. I remember it was kind of interesting because I don't know if you've had the experience of doctor outside your room like 11:30 at night, calling, trying to get an operating room scheduled, and they're saying, well, no, they don't. And I hear this doc shout, "Oh, morning won't do. The patient won't be alive in the morning," which was interesting to hear. But Anyway, I remember we got into that. I remember, I think I think people stayed with me till I went in were, I think, Dave and Sue Schwartz. Remember that? And I remember in recovery, I'm telling you, liver surgery is a bit of a problem. The recovery is at least as complicated as heart surgery. I had tubes for 4 days down the nose, fed that way. It was a bit pleasant, but I remember the visiting. I remember Schwartz coming a number of times. Jack Maniloff came down with lunch many days, and we had lunch together. Like Bill Green, was Kay Green's husband, and he didn't come to church a lot. She was, I think, employed in the office. He'd come down, join. I did hardly even knew that he knew I was there, but he came down and he would have lunch with me some days as well. And it was kind of interesting because when he had some surgery a bit after that, which I knew about, most people didn't, and I'd go visit him, and he would complain to Kay that, hey, only one person's visiting, nobody's visiting me. And Kay told him, well, that's because you signed in under an assumed name. You didn't want your students, medical students, to feel they had to come visit you, so you signed under a different name. Of course you had no visitors. But anyway, that was an interesting period. Linda was in 9 weeks, was it? Monroe Community and a whole lot of stuff. And we were in different hospitals, and it was a bit of a thing. Though I do on that period, I think that taught Linda and I a little bit about what was really a big deal, and other stuff being smaller deal. And I think it's one of the reasons we're not stressed by this current restrictions on being out in COVID, because it's just not as big a deal as some of the experiences we've had in the past. In more recent decades after that, I got more involved in UU stuff outside of the church, particularly during the period that Linda was president. I didn't really think I should have a high profile at the same time. Got involved in the then St. Lawrence district. I was in the UU. I did a lot of stuff with the UUA fundraising, an annual program fund, and I served as a board trustee for 8 years, and 4 under Bill Sinkford and 4 under Peter Morales. I was on audit for 4 years, and 5 years, I think, finance for 4, and 2 years on the ministerial fellowship committee, which was really the highlight of the thing. But it was just inspiring to interview young people and see the quality of the people going into the ministry. And of course, it was a spectrum of ages, but a lot were fairly young, and it was formative, and that was great. Interestingly, as an aside, I was the sponsor of the policy that said that a UUA trustee had to have 2 years of separation from serving before they could apply to be on UUA staff, which was what was violated when Scott Taylor mess. And it was interesting. I thought about that after. There was some wisdom in my thinking that you just, because the idea at the time, and I was backed by a number of other people, was that you shouldn't use a board position as a stepping stone to get a paid position. So the risk of that abuse suggested that we not allow that at all. Let's see where I am on. Well, it was nice to serve, and I'm doing a little now on a commission on appraisal. I've decided to try and keep a little involvement, but to back it down a bit, because when I was active as a trustee for several years there, I tracked, and I was out of Rochester 31 days a year on UUA business. So I was all over the U.S. on various committees and stuff. It was interesting at the time, but you know, it's beyond current capacity and interest. Um, um, I did some work. I was involved heavily, actually, with Dave Brubaker work when he was here, and I served on Joe Miller's ministerial advisory team. So all in all, I would, you know, involvement in First Unitarian is one of the best decisions of my life, even though it's mostly made by Linda at the time, but it grew on me. Dick taught me, Dick helped me evolve from secular humanism to what I would call religious humanism. They are actually distinctly different. And the church remains an important institution to me. And I really don't think I could fit anywhere else. You know, I'm not just non-Christian. I'm sad to admit I'm probably anti-Christian. I mean, I just have a different reading from having read a lot as a history major. Religions, I just felt a lot of warfare and a lot of things. You know, the basic premise may be about love and other people, but the practice has often been otherwise. And that can be said to some extent of Judaism. And, you know, I never really got into this smiting and smoting language and other. So I just don't fit. I've developed more respect for other religions and tolerance, and I've taken some courses from, you know, Ann Meredith, and got a different understanding of the early Catholicism, you know, and the formation of hospitals and the home-based religions and a lot of other. And I'm doing something now with Thomas Driscoll, who's a Catholic theologian who's got a group that Linda and I are doing some reading with. So my views have, you know, mellowed there as well. But the reality is I don't fit anywhere other than in the church. And if I drop into periods of non-attendance, my cynicism returns. I find that I need the church to keep me more positively focused. I think that's pretty much what I had in my notes. I'm ready if Libby wants to move to questions.